What is now known as Taiwan has been known by different names. We remember that sometimes it's called Chinese Taipei. At one time, I think it was even known as Formosa. So that it has, that particular island, from a Chinese perspective, from the look at the various dynasties and the history of China, the Chinese have always held the view that that is part of mainland China in the same way as Hong Kong is, in the same way as Macau is. But history being what it is, we know that the Dutch were there, we know that the Japanese were there until 1952. So that there is a history of linkage between the Chinese people and the Taiwanese. They are the same people. And the renegades from the eyes of mainland China who went into Taiwan and now put together this administration, which since the 1940s and 50s has been backed by Western powers, particularly the United States. So that history exists. Nobody denies that these are the same people with a history that is verifiable and indeed acknowledged. China has always maintained that Taiwan is part of its territory, and that if the Taiwanese administration were to make a decision to declare independence, they would seize it by force. And in the recent past, we have seen that there have been two major forces within Taiwan itself, within the population. Even in the most recent elections, you see there are parties that are pro-China. Pro-China to mean that they want to have discussions and negotiations and closer relationship with China. And there are those parties, or a party that is outrightly against China. And the demographics show that when opinion polls are held, the majority of the population do not want to become part of China. And the reason is this is the reason that they give. But if they become part of China, then they lose what they describe as democracy, which is what they practice, and they claim that that is not practiced in China. But the Chinese have always argued that they would administer Taiwan in the manner that Macau and Hong Kong are being administered. The United States of America, on the other hand, having become the hegemon after the World War II, now see Taiwan not as a renegade state or renegade province of China, but they see it as a country which ought to be given proper recognition and which ought to be independent. But remember that even the American government doesn't quite come out that boldly, because they recognize that China is an emerging power which you can't play about with. So I believe that in as much as the Chinese are not desirous of engaging in any military activity with Taiwan, they continue to hold that threat in what I call gunboat diplomacy, if only to keep Taiwan in check. From a geopolitical standpoint, the Americans and the Western world also see Taiwan as being significant for their military activities in the South China Sea. So they look at Taiwan, they look at the Philippines, and if you go even a little further, they look at the South Koreans. And this must be understood in the context of geopolitics. But to come back to your question as you posed it, my view is that indeed the Chinese have always said, you misbehave, then we are going to use such power as is necessary to make sure that you remain within the Chinese fold. God forbid In matters of war, I normally ask myself, what does winning mean? Women, because people think that winning is having the military victory, but history has demonstrated that that is not victory. Victory is a lot more complex. The reality is that one cannot predict. Remember that China is a nuclear power. Remember that the United States of America itself may not have the appetite to fight a war that is so far removed from their shores. Remember that there may come into the United States administration an administration that has no appetite for that kind of war. So I hope that that war will never come about. And in any event, if it were to happen, it would be devastating. And there would be no victors and no losers in the context of defining victory and loss in a proper manner, not just military ascendancy. You know, one of the things that is now happening in many of African countries is this idea of hosting military bases and having military exercises. It brings you into the sphere of a conflict which you do not understand nor control. If somebody were to imagine that your base is being used as a launch pad for military activities that affect them, then with seagoing vessels, with warships which are in the Indian Ocean, who tells you that those military hardware cannot be used to target East Africa, or indeed any military base anywhere in the world which is deemed to be hostile? The world has become so small, and nobody would be excluded from conflicts, however far-flung they are geographically from themselves. So African countries must ask themselves very key questions when they are hosting military bases, because they can be sucked into conflicts that they do not understand and do not control, and they find themselves as hapless victims. And in any event, most of the militaries that we have in Africa really don't have the capacity to withstand a sustained war in terms of hardware that they need to prosecute those wars. So you can never say never. A conflict in China can very well affect us in East Africa and indeed in any part of Africa. And that is in the arena of speculation. But one of the most important, what is emerging, is that Kenya is now being seen as a lackey of the United States. We have seen in the recent past the kind of activities that have been taking place in Kenya with senior military officers, senior foreign affairs officials from the United States of America, from the European Union visiting Kenya. And in many circles, Kenya is being seen as a country that has made the decision to incline to the West. Even in the ongoing conflict in Gaza, Kenya is one of the few countries in the continent of Africa that has actually come out to say that we support the Israelis, and one of the few countries that has not condemned what the world thinks are genocidal activities taking place within the territory of Gaza. That is perception, and perception is what controls the world. And when you are perceived to be pursuing a particular cause, then when there is pain to be visited upon those who support a cause, then that pain will be visited upon you. You know, I'm one who is very skeptical about these latter-day evangelists who, when they go to countries, they say they are going to redeem the country. When Hinn came to Kenya, was about to come to Kenya, he said this was a renewal of the country that he had prayed for. He would pray for the country. He came, like many of them have come before he is gone. The country remains where it was before he came. And Hinn himself has a very controversial history. You only have to read read the writings of his own relative, Hinn, and you'll know that he belongs to the class of what I call latter-day evangelists who are in the business of propagating a theology which remains very controversial. Very controversial. Some even say unbiblical. And that is the context in which I see him. The way we have behaved, the way the Kenyan administration has behaved and given our foreign policy, it is quite clear to me that when we are called upon to choose in the event of any major conflict where the US goes, where NATO goes, that is where Kenya will go. We have said so. We have behaved so. We have demonstrated so. In other words, we have chosen sides. And these are some of the things that very early on in the 1950s, when the non-aligned movement was being put together, it was said that African countries should avoid that path. We should be non-aligned and positively neutral. But at critical moments in Kenya's history, we have demonstrated that we are quick to follow paths that are unpopular. There was a time when we even appeared to be supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa because of our foreign policy. And once again, we appear to be supporting activities which are not very popular within the African context. When you play politics which is partisan, then it has its possible consequences. If there is a major conflict that pits China and the United States, and you know that the United States is a major power, they can make demands of Kenya. They can say, if you are with us, then our enemies are your enemies. And therefore we want you to behave as such. God forbid that that would happen. And that is why neutrality, particularly for countries such as Kenya, in my view, ought to be the path to be chosen. Neutral, not that you are blind to that which is good and right, but neutral that you don't take sides of things that you can't understand. So my fear is that we are putting ourselves almost on a daily basis in an environment where we are being judged very harshly by our would-be friends because we are following, in certain cases, almost blindly. And that is not good for us. I mean, if there is war that involves the Western nations purportedly in defense of Taiwan, it would disrupt economic activity in China. Remember, China is the factory of the world, and it has remained and still is the factory of the world because there is peace and quiet, because all resources are being directed towards production of goods and services that the world needs. But in the event of conflict, what necessarily and what happens is that you divert your resources in order to finance the war. And remember that these countries that will want to fight you will not be fighting in their own territory. They'll be fighting far away from your territory, and therefore they will be harming you, and they'll ensure that the entire logistical systems that finance your very being are curtailed. So it would be a devastating war. And because these are military countries with nuclear capability, with intercontinental ballistic missiles, you cannot predict how that will ensure to suck people even in far removed areas. I believe that these countries, when we talk about intercontinental ballistic missiles, they can hit each other in their very territory, even if the war is not in their immediate vicinity. It is the kind of war that you don't even want to contemplate. It is the kind of war that should be avoided. It is the kind of war that should be mediated, the kind of situation that should be mediated by the United Nations organization. But the United Nations organization, as we know, is also becoming weaker by the day. And if we had any doubt, its inability to stop the war in Gaza is in itself indicative of how weak it has become. And when you are dealing with countries, all of which are members of the Security Council with veto powers, you can only imagine what they can do in that environment. So it would be the kind of war that would divide the world into half in terms of allegiance. The Chinese are very clear. The Chinese have been very consistent that they must have Taiwan as a part of China. And if you want to judge Chinese commitment, look at how they pursued Hong Kong. It tells you and gives you an idea of how they will deal with the Taiwanese situation. And I believe that on a daily basis, they are trying to assess the situation. Assess the situation because they know the Americans have entered into a military pact with the Taiwanese saying, if you attack Taiwan, then we'll get involved. But sometimes those pacts don't act that way because the Americans will also assess the possible cost of their involvement in the war. And if indeed at a certain stage there is an administration in the United States of America which says we are going to look at America first, and that is what President Trump during his presidency was saying, let us not be the policeman of the world. Let people take care of themselves. And if that were to happen and a Trump presidency were to be a reality in the year 2025, in the month of January, and the message is clear that this is the time to intervene, I would not be surprised myself that the Chinese can then say, this is the time. Or they can heighten the diplomatic activity and use elements within Taiwan to call for a negotiation. In fact, I personally hold the view that in the not too distant future, there will be some kind of engagement between Taiwan and China, and it will be agreed that we have some kind of relationship where you are recognized as such. Remember, there is only the one China policy, so that Taiwan has very few embassies, is recognized by very few countries, if at all, which means that at the diplomatic level, they are very weak. The only thing that gives them strength is the backing of the United States of America, which says we will not stand by as you are being militarily occupied by mainland China. But this appetite for America to defend a country that is far flung from their territory is an appetite that may not always be there. So the Chinese keep on saying, time is on our side, and we will wait them out. Holding all factors constant, that is already happening. I was looking at the statistics on the GDP, which is not a very good measure for size of an economy. But the Chinese GDP by the year 2021 was 17.7, just before COVID, 17.7 trillion. And the American GDP was 21 point something trillion, which tells me that if things were to remain the way they are, in the next 10 years, by dint of nominal GDP, the Chinese economy will be the largest economy in the world.